You guys better be willing to participate in this conversation. Otherwise, I'm not going to have a whole hell of a lot to say. By the way, are you okay with the camera? Do you need to move the computer or anything? Fine. Okay, so I'm not going to have a lot to say unless it's willing to talk, so I'm going to set you up for that right now. By way of background, I'm spending a lot of time reading and studying and thinking about complexity science. And one of the things that hit me is that if the world works that way, it has some real implications for program theory. Because it means that a lot of the programs we work either, we evaluate either don't work the way we think they do, or they work the way we think we do, but they work in other ways as well. And my thought is that since program theory has a lot to do with methodology, data collection, data interpretation, that's worth thinking about this stuff. So my idea is to lay out for you the various speculations that I've been thinking about, and you're going to help me figure out whether it makes any sense or not, I hope. Whoops.
I don't think you're in the view.
That's the picture of chaos in Greek mythology, by the way. As I like to say, it's a very strange example. I like the picture. So I'll just say it again. If you think about, which I'll explain, in the field of complexity, we see behavior we don't usually see. Some of it is pretty straightforward, and you'll recognize some of it is pretty weird stuff. And one of the things I like to say is that when we think about the world not behaving according to common sense, we know that's true at very small distances, but we don't really care very much. We know that's true at very high speeds. We know that's true at very long distances. Space is curved, all this stuff. It's all very interesting. None of it makes any sense, but it doesn't really matter to us very much because it doesn't really have anything to do with the world we live in. Some of this complexity stuff does have something to do with the world we live in. So essentially, I'm going to talk about what would happen if the world would work that way. And I got to be very careful here because all this complexity stuff, it's almost a religious question whether or not the world works according to these principles. And I promise not to deal with any of that. And so it might just be a question of metaphor. Sort of what if it looked as if the world works this way? Some of it might in fact be that that's how the world works, but I can assure you I have no intention whatsoever of getting into that issue. So you can take it as metaphor, you can take it as real, but it's impossible to really deal with that, and I'm not going to. What I'm going to do is give a couple of examples and hope that I can give you some examples, you can give me some examples, because as I said, otherwise it's going to be a very short talk. And I'm going to stick to the easy stuff. I'm going to stick to the garden variety kinds of programs that at least I evaluate, and I suspect most of you do as well. So this whole idea that we evaluate programs based on simple program theories, which is problematic because programs and the problems we try to solve have all kinds of complex and complicated dynamics to them, and isn't that a problem? The fact that governments fund programs based on the assumption of simple solutions when the solutions aren't simple, that's all true. There's a lot of very interesting stuff in complexity science that deals with all of that, but I'm not going to talk about any of it. We'll talk about it later maybe, but what I really want to do is sort of talk about the stuff that I deal with on a daily basis, and I presume many of you do on a daily basis as well. There are a couple of well-defined program components that you can draw out pretty well, a couple of reasonably expected outcomes that you can wrap a methodology around to measure. There are a couple of probably unexpected outcomes that you can wrap a methodology around to measure, and I'm happy to talk about that as well sometime. We're going to talk about the stuff that I usually do. And by the way, the stuff that I usually do is I do a lot of work on safety in railroads. It's pretty straightforward, right? You've got a railroad, you're implementing a new safety program, it has effects on accident rates, it has effect on safety culture, it has effects on labor management relationships. It's pretty straightforward. I know how to measure that stuff. We have cross-railroad comparisons, we have time series, we have quantitative data, we have qualitative data. We just go in and do it. There's nothing fancy about it. I do get to ride on freight locomotives. And so that's the kind of stuff we're going to talk about today. Whoops. There we go. There's a problem in doing this, right? I mean, this is kind of the analogy I like to use. If I said to someone I'm going to analyze the problem with statistics, he'd say, that's sort of a useless statement because I don't know what statistics you're going to use. But I could give a lecture on statistical reasoning, right? I could say I'm going to analyze the problem using statistical reasoning. And, probably within an hour I could explain to most people what that meant. Explain about, error scores being uncorrelated with true scores. We would talk about sampling and variances and all that stuff. And by the time you got through, people would have some reasonable understanding of what statistical reasoning meant. And then if I sort of told them about some exotic statistical test, they'd say, well, I don't know what that is, but I'll believe this guy that it's sort of based on this kind of reasoning. And in fact, that's the way the world works. I mean, how many times have you guys ever reported a t-test and you really believed the people you were talking to knew what a t-test meant? Right? That's not so easy. It's just that we're used to thinking of significance tests, and so most people will shrug and accept it. But you can do that with statistical reasoning. The problem with this complexity stuff is you can't do that. So if you say, I'm going to analyze the problem with complexity, right, you could ask all these questions. What aspect? What's it good for? How does it work? But there's no single lecture that and I don't think there's no single lecture that anybody else can give that will sort of pull that together and, sort of so that there'd be an analog to statistical reasoning. So the best I can, there's a huge debate in the field about whether or not that's ever going to be possible or not. But I can assure you, if anybody figures out how to do it, it will not be me. So there's no grand unified theory. There may never be one. If there is one, I can't give it to you right now because I don't know what it is and nobody does. So the best I can do is say that there is this field called complexity science, and all kinds of interesting, different phenomena crop up in it. And all I can do is give you some examples. So that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to give you some examples of how it works. I'm going to give you some examples of how I think it affects program theory. And I'm sure hoping you guys can come up with some examples as well, because, as I said, otherwise it's going to be a short talk. And therefore, I don't mind if you interrupt me with questions. So here's one example. Give me some time. I'll explain this for you. Okay. Oh, by the way, so this is not connected to the internet. That is. I'm going to show you guys a great demonstration.
Pull it up on the internet and then you just need to flip over the other thing.
How do I do that? Where are we here? Like, no,
You just go in here and here.
here. I don't know what the format is, though. I just have a hot link to it.
What's your hot link?
I have no idea.
Oh my goodness.
Forget it. We're not going to do it.
It's in Chinese.
We're not going to do
Yeah,
it.
we have help. Joking.
That was a German joke.
What I'm going to do is give you an example of mathematical systems. Okay. Whether or not this is going to happen in the kinds of programs we work with, we're going to talk about in a minute. But let me just give you an example. This equation up here it's a logistic equation, and it's really a very simple equation. It's the classic, how many bunny rabbits are there going to be the next year kind of thing, and the number of bunny rabbits the next year is going to be some growth factor, number of bunny rabbits this year times 1 minus the number of bunny rabbits last year, because otherwise the bunny rabbits will expand infinitely. And we know that doesn't happen in the forest. So it's really a very simple equation, right? And you can plot this equation, and you would think that nothing strange happens, but it does. This is what it looks like at R equals 2, and it's really too bad. It is such a cool demo. I should have downloaded it. R equals 2, as you go through this equation, things just sort of work out. It's pretty cool. R equals 3, they work out pretty well too, but you don't get an equal number of bunny rabbits every year, but you get a predictable number of bunny rabbits every other year. R equals 3.7, if you stretch this out long enough, there will actually be some regularities to it. 1, 2, 3, yeah, there would be some regularities to it. At R equals 4, there are no regularities to it. This is a truly informally chaotic system. Now, what I find interesting about this, other than the fact that it's a very cool thing to contemplate, is that there's an insight here, and the insight is that this system here is completely and totally self-contained. Now, when I evaluate programs, I usually think about, I've made myself a little logic model down here, but I usually think about this stuff down here. I think, well, we do think about systems, so I've got this program, but there's a policy environment, and there's research evidence that keeps changing about the effectiveness of the program, and maybe some changes in the economics or changes in the kinds of people that are coming into it. But I'm always looking at outside factors that are going to affect the program, because I have a feeling that this program of mine is going to begin to act very strangely if I don't take account of those outside factors. And so there's usually some kind of an observation, some kind of an M&E kind of an effort, or just sort of some interviews, but there's always some effort that I make to look at the outside environment. And that's probably worthwhile, because the outside environment does have an effect. But it's not inconceivable if we believe that things like this can happen, right? I mean, what this is telling us is that even a simple system can exhibit chaotic behavior strictly internally. If we believe anything like that, what I have to believe is that this program of mine, looking like B, stripping out those external factors, can still behave in unpredictable ways. This shows up a lot, by the way, in economics. I'm not an economist, but as I understand it, all of the econometric models always assume that if they don't provide predictable consequences, it's because there are these unknown shocks from the outside, and therefore the equations don't work quite right. The new way of thinking about the world is that maybe there aren't shocks from the outside, and the economy really is a complex system, and therefore you begin to see these very strange effects in the economy, not because the equations aren't good enough, but because the equations aren't modeling in a complex system, and that means that the economy can do strange things in and of itself without any outside shocks. So I think a lot about that when I do evaluation. Now, the truth is, in most programs you evaluate, you're never going to see anything like this, because the truth is that if you're running a program and things begin to act in strange ways, you're not going to say, well, okay, we're just going to let things go here, right? If you're any good at running a program, you're going to intervene in some way. So this notion that you're going to be sort of formally chaotic systems in the program that you operate because nobody's watching the store, if really nobody's watching the store, you have no business evaluating it, because the people running it don't know what they're doing. All you can do is a process evaluation report that the people don't know what they're doing. So in the real world, it's not going to quite look like that. But it's also true that things can happen internally. And sort of to give examples, in these programs that I'm evaluating, we're always looking at things like, has the Federal Railroad, I work on trains, as I said, so, has the Federal Railroad Administration changed any policies? Or are there any national labor disputes going on such that the way in which organized labor in these railroads is going to interact with the program might change? And any number, has there been a change in the company policy that might affect this? So there's any number of things going on outside the program that we keep track of. But the truth of the matter is that it's pretty clear to me that things are happening internal to the program that can cause the program to work very well or very poorly, or simply do things we didn't expect. There can be a minor labor dispute that cascades through everybody involved and really affects whether or not people are willing to work together and so on and so forth. There can be particular kinds of what they call corrective actions that they solve that have consequences that ripple through the program. So the point is there are all these different things that can happen internal to the program. Now, the truth is you don't need this kind of an insight to come up with that idea, and I can pretty much guarantee, at least to myself, that everybody here has thought about this stuff. But when I think about complex systems and I think about chaotic behavior, by the way, I'm not going to define chaotic behavior because that in itself is a whole complicated problem that I don't want to deal with right now, so let's just assume that it's somewhat unpredictable, random-like, but it isn't. We'll just sort of take it at face value. But the notion that this can happen for internal reasons, unrelated to the outside world, really has had an effect on how I think about programs. Would I have thought about that stuff anyway if I didn't know anything about dynamical systems? Probably so on some intuitive level. But it's given me a framework and a language and a way of understanding this that makes me much more sensitive to what's going on, to the notion that even if I don't think about, even if there is no effect in the outside world, from the point of view of program theory, I can expect programs to behave in unexpected ways. That helps me a lot. I don't know, I suppose I should ask the question. I told you about my railroads, and I told you this was going to be a short talk unless people have any examples. Stuff that's happened unrelated to the outside world that, have caused programs to behave in unpredictable ways. I won't beat up on people if they don't have examples, but if you have any examples, that would be a good thing. No, I'll go on. That's okay. So anyway, here's one example. And this word insight is important to me because I don't want to imply that these kinds of programs behave like this equation, because in fact they don't. I'm sure they don't. Because that, as I said, that would imply that nobody running these programs is watching the store. Everybody's watching the store. On the other hand, I used to think about programs systematically as if unanticipated things are going to happen. It's because something is happening in the environment that is making that program behave in unexpected ways. And I've kind of changed my mind about that. And now what I believe is that there are things that can happen internal to the program that will make it behave in unexpected ways, and I begin to look at that systematically. And as I said, the word insight is critical. I've heard this used a lot by people who talk about complex systems, because they don't believe that sort of complicated social programs like this work like that. But you will hear people say, insight from looking at complexity, right, is that simple systems can behave in unexpected ways, and then they go ahead and apply that to any number of phenomena, whether it's the growth of cities or helping diabetics control their blood sugar or getting kids to learn more math or whatever it might be. They begin to think about, here are straightforward systems, and we need to think about them behaving in unexpected ways just because. So that's one thought that I have. It would be a great demo, but it was a long URL to try to copy. Oh, I can't show this one either. Boy, is that too bad.
It's
no,
a
I
Rorschach,
can show.
Johnny.
What?
It's a Rorschach.
No, I can show this one. Hang on a minute. In fact, I'll run this demo for you in a minute, because I actually have that logo on this computer, but let me explain what's going on here. This is another insight from complexity. What it really has to do, honest to God, I'll explain. What it really has to do with is segregation in communities. Okay, now, you really think about why communities separate out by race, by ethnicity, or whatever. You can think of all kinds of psychological dynamics and sociological dynamics and, economics and how banks behave and so on and so forth. When I think about it, that's what I would think about. Well, it turns out that may not be true. And here's the example, and I'll run this for you in a minute. But what you have on the left, and by the way, I'm a little bit encumbered here because on the left you have green and red dots, but I'm a bit colorblind, and so I guess I'll have to take your word for it that these things are green and red. I can't see them here. I have trouble seeing them down here. Essentially, the way it works is that you take a bunch of people, families, whatever, you dump them randomly into a neighborhood. You have green and red ones. And they look around and they make a real simple decision. A real simple decision is, I want, pick a number, 70% of my neighbors to look like me. If they don't look like me, I'm going to move. If they look like me, I'm not going to move. Right? That's the only rule. And what happens is you sort of drop these mythical families into the neighborhood. Each one looks around. They count the number of immediate neighbors that look like them and say, it's okay, I'm going to move, or, I'm not going to move. And they do what they do, right? Now their world has changed, and they do it again. They look around and they say, how many of my neighbors look like me? And if it's 70% or more, or 40%, whatever they decide, either they're going to move or not going to move. And what happens, and I'm going to show you this in a minute, is that you can go from here to here. Now what you have here are really pretty segregated communities, and even I can tell that these guys are red, and these guys are green, and well, these guys are sort of in between, and they're still in a mixed community, but you can see how this thing is separated out. Let me give you an example of that. For that, I need to get out of the show. Do I have that logo running? I do. File. Models library. Yes, social science. I think that's where it is. Segregation, that's where it is. It's going to load. Okay, so you're going to set this up, and let's say that you've got, it's hard to see, let's say you've got about 1,000 families in the neighborhood. All right, and let's say you say that you want 50% of them to look like me. You can just set that up. You can set that up. Let's make it go slowly. Let's see what's going on here. And you're going to watch what happens, and sure enough, pretty soon that separates out, right? And you can do this with whatever parameters you want, right? If you want, not too many people, it's going to look totally different, and it's not going to quite separate out quite so dramatically. If you want lots of people to look like you can go, and it's going to stop pretty soon. You can see the percent symbol and the people unhappy because they don't have the right number of numbers. And we can stop. How do we stop this? We stop. Whoops. Stop. Right, you can see it's beginning to separate out. And what I really did is simply pull up a slide that has an example, and I picked a couple of parameters. We have a particularly obvious example here. But the point is, this is a real good example of emergent behavior. And I certainly think about stuff like this all the time, because when I think of program theory, I take this example of segregation, I come up with any number of complicated, logic models or program theory models, or whatever you want to call them, and as I said, involving economics and what realtors do, and social psychology, and quality of school systems, and I go on and on and on, and I contemplate these very complicated models in my head. Now, those might still be correct. I don't want to say that those are wrong. But what I do want to say is there is an example. This is emergent behavior, and I'm not going to worry about defining emergent behavior either. But the notion is that based on some very simple rules, you can explain the behavior. Now, if I had a program to sort of deal with minimizing segregation, and I didn't think at least about the possibility of a dynamic like this driving the behavior, right? I'd have these big complicated models, as I said, with all these different variables, and God knows how many relationships I'd hypothesize amongst all those variables, and I ended up with this big complicated model, and there'd probably be some feedback loops involved, and whether or not I really believe the model like that, that's another issue I have. So you make these complicated models, and if you take a step back and give them the sniff test, I think most people would believe that you don't really know enough about the world to specify those kinds of models. But in any case, I would build a model like that. I'd consult with all the stakeholders, and we'd have some arguments about what should be in there and what the feedback loop should be, but we'd eventually agree on it, and I'd say, okay, that's the model. Let's go build an evaluation around the assumption that things work this way. Well, maybe things don't work that way. So if you've got this kind of emergent behavior, it may very well be that the entire program theory is wrong, right? Which means that you're measuring the wrong inputs, you're measuring the wrong variables, any explanation of data that you have is likely to be incorrect, and so on and so forth. So there's another kind of an example. Now, in a lot of the programs that I deal with, or that we deal with, Whether or not this kind of stuff is happening or not is always questionable, but it's equally questionable whether these complicated program theories that we develop are in fact how the world works. And now, obviously, if you're developing a program theory based on a whole lot of validated research, that's another story, right? Because, the classic example would be things like innovation adoption, and you base that on all of Rogers' research and things like that. You could say, look, there's a really good research base to justify these complicated kinds of models that we build, and we know that the data are valid or at least reliable and we can use them. But in most of the evaluations I do, there's very little of that. I have to say it's not for lack of trying, but it's always been amazing to me how little the people I'm working for, doing evaluation for, actually want to look at that stuff, which, I had that experience recently. We were evaluating an R&D program, and I pulled out a model that sort of really was based on the research and the theory of how innovations work through the R&D life cycle and what looks like success and so on and so forth. They took one look at it and said, we don't want any of that. Here's a picture, and and this is what we think is going on, and use this model. And I said, what can you do? I tried. But the point is that most of the models we have are really based on people's common sense. At least most of the models I deal with. I can't say I'm happy with that, but it's true. And so, and whenever that happens, I think to myself, if you've got lots of interacting parts, I use the word part because this word agent I use as a technical word that maybe best not to get into at the moment, right? But you have all these different parts, and they might be interacting based on some very simple rules, and those very simple rules might end up explaining everything that I've got. That question. Too bad.
Just flexing my hand.
Well, you guys are making this tough for me. But as I said, here is another insight, and I don't want to. And whether or not it's metaphor, whether or not it's real, those are separate questions. But when I look at a lot of programs, and I see a lot of interacting parts, and people begin to develop very complicated models to explain this stuff, I sit back and I say to myself, maybe it's really pretty simple. And it doesn't mean I can really figure out what those interaction rules are. It's not a good word, interaction. It's another technical word with a technical word. Whether or not all of those rules that explain how these agents interact with each other are actually acting in this real world. You can do that with a computer simulation, by the way. And that might be worthwhile. But what you can't do is ignore the possibility that really it might be simple. That's another example that I have. Oh, by the way, if you ever do look at net logo simulations, they all look like this. If you want to know the code that runs it, it's there. If you want to know what it's all about, there's always an explanation. If you go to the net logo site, you can download the application, you can get the library. Every single one of them will have those 3 tabs. Run it. Here's what it's all about. Here's the code. So anyway, that's another example I think about quite a lot. Let's take a look at another example. Attractors, right? An attractor is pretty simple. An attractor simply means the space in which something moves around and where it ends up. The classic example is a pendulum. Oh, let's try this. I can make this work. There we go. It's an animated chip. I've got the pendulum working. But here are some. So what an attractor simply means is a space, and I'm not going to define space in technical terms either, but it's a space in which something moves in a predictable way. Here's how I think about this when I do evaluation. I really have 2 examples here. I think about the National Security Agency, which has certainly been in the news lately. And I'm looking at this agency and I'm thinking to myself, what is it all about, right? It has a mission. The mission is to collect as much information as possible. There's a legal framework that allows it to collect that information, right? But it works in great secrecy, and what that really means is that it can push the limits of that legal framework, and it can push the limits of that legal framework because nobody really knows what it's doing. And it has access both to incredible technology and also the world's greatest cryptographers. So I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking, given that situation, here's the attractor that I believe is operating for the National Security Agency, which is it is moving along a straight line always towards collecting more and more information. Now, the reason that matters to me, not that anybody would ever let me evaluate a program at the National Security Agency, but if I were, whatever that program happened to be, even if it's training employees or employee assistance program or helping people use some new kind of technology, which I don't have a top secret clearance, so that would never happen. But whatever it might be, what I would say to myself is, this is the direction this organization is moving in, and I need to interpret the likely outcomes of whatever program I have as being compatible with this notion that there's only one way this organization is going. And that's not exactly true. You know, we certainly see that the NSA has gotten its wings clipped lately. But for the most part, that's the attractor. It moves in one direction, and there are good reasons for it, right? And I think these are good reasons to understand why it is that that agency is only moving in that direction. And so if I were evaluating any program, I would say to myself, the secrecy and the data collection are only going to increase, and what consequences might that have for this program that I'm evaluating? And I think that out because that's what I believe is an attractor to the National Security Agency. The other example, which I actually do know a lot about and which I do not need a top secret security clearance to work on, is a federal regulatory agency, right? And it turns out that federal regulatory agencies historically really think about dealing with the industries that they that they regulate in two ways. One is strictly they're the cops, right? Their job is to inspect, their job is to enforce, their job is to lay fines, right? And that's really what the FAA, the FRA, FTC, all these people, that's what they do, right? They are federal regulatory agencies. They look to see if an industry is doing a bad thing, they try to punish the industry. Right. The problem with doing that, and they know this, is the same problem that police have, right? Talk to any cop, and they'll say, sure, I can absolutely go ahead and impose the absolute letter of the law, but if I do this, I'm not going to ultimately succeed in public safety, right? I need discretion, right? That's what the police will tell you, and they're right about that. So the other way that you see these federal, and they know that, so the other way you see the federal regulatory agencies working is to essentially say to the industry, look, we're going to specify the requirements, the safety requirements, but we're going to work cooperatively with you. We're going to cut you a fair amount of slack in terms of how you go about assuring safety. And you get a lot of that. If you remember a couple of years ago, the FAA got into trouble because they grounded all of these flights at O'Hare Airport because the inspections, can you remember this story, 4 or 5 years ago? Yeah, you probably fly out of Chicago a lot. But what basically happened is that the FAA was easing up on its enforcement and letting the industry kind of do what it wanted on the assumption if it worked cooperatively with the industry, then they would actually have better safety records. And on some level that's true, but of course what happens is you get these crises, right? And every once in a while, you get too far over into this cooperative realm, and there's usually some big public relations problem like trains carrying oil crashing, or planes getting grounded, right? Everybody gets upset, and the public gets upset, and the politicians get upset, and all of a sudden you've got a lot of pressure, and the agencies swing back to strict enforcement. Right? The problem, of course, is that over time, strict enforcement alone doesn't work. Right? And getting the right mix isn't quite right, and the truth is, in whatever direction they're going, it seems pretty comfortable and can keep going that way until either they have a realization all this enforcement isn't helping, right, or there's some crisis because they've been too, quote, cozy, unquote, with industry, and then all of a sudden they have to crack down, right? To me, that's an attractor pendulum, right? They keep going back and forth and back and forth. And I think about this a lot because I evaluate programs for the FRA. And it is a cooperative program. It's a program in which the FRA is saying, we will give you waivers, official waivers for some of the rules, on the assumption we can train you in root cause, well, sort of lean Six Sigma problem solving, and if you're managers and the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen and the United Transportation Union, they're going to get together in a room and you're going to figure out what these problems are, and you're going to get those corrective actions moved up through the corporation, you're going to solve these problems, and so on and so forth, right? And that's an inherently cooperative system, and as I said, we're evaluating it in terms of outcomes like accidents, injuries, organizational culture, and so on. But I know perfectly well that if there is any kind of a problem, what we really have here is the FRA, in this case, sort of moving all the way over in this direction. And I know that historically it's going to swing back and forth, and that means on a probability basis, something's going to happen, and it's going to become, from a point of view of public relations or for political reasons, unpalatable for the FRA to work that way, and that might actually have a huge effect on whether or not this program is sustainable or not. It has nothing to do with whether it's successful or not. It is, by the way, there are lots of reports on that subject. But it has nothing to do with whether or not this program is successful or not. I know the attractors that federal regulatory agencies move through, right? And it looks more like that pendulum in a straight line. So do you need to think about these kinds of attractors to understand how the program might behave? The answer is no. I think intuitively, if you guys were doing these evaluations, although you might not think of attractors, it wouldn't surprise me if you sort of factored this kind of thinking into what you're doing. But I can tell you that when I look at programs and I look at the things that I'm evaluating, I always think to myself, is there an attractor here? Is there some definable pattern unrelated to the actual thing I'm evaluating that's going to explain how this organization might behave over time that might have an effect on this subset that I'm evaluating, which is whatever it happens to be. So, for whatever it's worth, I find thinking about attractors useful. And it only helps if I know quite a bit about the program. I don't know a lot about the NSA, but I've certainly been thinking a lot about it. I've been following the story pretty quickly. I've been doing it closely, and I've been doing a lot of thinking about why does the NSA behave the way it behaves, right? And I don't know if this is the complete list, but what I did is made a list and said, look, here are the dynamics that are affecting the NSA, right? And that has implications for what it's going to do in terms of what directions it's going to move in. And here are the dynamics that are affecting, in this case, the Federal Railroad Administration, but we've seen it in the FAA, we've seen it in the Pipeline Hazardous Materials agency. They're the ones that actually worry about pipelines. As you can imagine, the sort of regulatory and cooperative issues that they've been dealing with lately. So I think a lot about this notion of attractors. And attractors are key insights coming out of complexity science. So there we have another example.
I have a question.
Sure. Oh, good.
So
It'll take a long time answering it.
Okay. I see the pendulum there, and it had me, and you're talking about attractors, and it made me think, and thinking about the going back and forth between say, more regulation and then, et cetera. Does every attractor, or is it common for attractors to have like an anti-attractor then on the other side?
No, look at the NSA example, right? I'm not saying there are no countervening forces. The NSA has had its wings split, but not at all. I mean, attractors can look like all kinds of things. And they don't have to be in two-dimensional space either, but that sort of blows my mind, so I can't quite think of it in those terms. This is an attractor, right? I'll read the definition again. I stole it from Wikipedia.
Right.
In dynamical systems, an attractor is a set of physical properties towards which the system tends to evolve, regardless of the starting conditions, right? That's really what an attractor is. And you think about the pendulum, actually, if this thing worked the way it should, the attractor would be a dead spot right there. I mean, in this pendulum, there's some energy being imparted into the system, or it would stop at some point, right? And so the attractor for a pendulum is that it's a dead stop in the middle.
Oh, the center point. Okay, I was thinking.
But in the case of the Federal Regulatory Agency, if you want to continue the metaphor, there is always force, energy being imparted, work being imparted into the system, right? Because either the politics or the effort to pursue mission is really sort of pushing that pendulum in one direction or another, right? And so that's why in a physical system, the attractor on a pendulum is a point, but in a system where you're putting energy into the system, the attractor is this continual thing. But it could be a circle, it could be a spiral, I mean, it can be anything, okay? I just try to pick these two examples. But as I said, when I do evaluation, I say to myself, do I understand this organization or this context well enough, right, that I can think about what the space that will move in is? Right? Because if that's true, that's going to affect the program that I'm evaluating. And as I said, this example of the confidential post-call reporting system is a good one. I know perfectly well that over time, I actually like this program, I hope it's not true, but I know perfectly well that over time, something might happen completely unrelated to how successful this program is that's going to move that agency back in the other direction, and everything we've been looking at in terms of the sustainability of that program over time might go away. Now, I have other reasons for believing that's not true because it's being disseminated widely in the industry, and I won't get into that right now. But it certainly affects my thinking about sustainability. And when we started this evaluation, it's pretty straightforward, right? We did formative evaluation, how is it being implemented, what's going on, doing a lot of outcome evaluation, safety culture, accidents, etc. Doing a lot of sustainability stuff, right? One of the things I finally got them to believe is that the factors that are going to explain the continuation of that program may not be the factors that explain the fact that it got started in the first place or what its outcomes are. So you really need to think about that as an independent issue. I mean, luckily you don't have to collect too much data in addition because all this other data we're collecting will do it pretty much, but it certainly affects data interpretation, right? So when these people are thinking a lot about sustainability, and I'm thinking about sustainability also, but I'm thinking to myself, it's a federal regulatory agency, this is how it's moving, there's a certain likelihood that this is going to happen. But, attractors can be anything. The real question is, do you know enough about the context that you can think that way? And I think in terms of the NSA and the FRA, I do. But there are other evaluations that I'm dealing with that I really don't. I'm doing a lot of evaluation of research and development programs right now. And you think the attractors are, going to move along from the pure research to the developed, to the commercialization. And, in theory, that's the attractor, but really that's not the case. And I actually don't feel that I know enough about the R&D situation to think that way. Or there may not be one. It doesn't have to be one every time. Okay, should I go on? Any more questions? Can we do it on time? You don't have enough time. Phil, we'll come back to finish. After all, I don't have to worry about this. Chaotic attractor is another cool thing. What a chaotic attractor is a situation where, see that little point moving around, okay? This is certainly an attractor. If you remember the definition of an attractor, this is an attractor. If I drop something into this, it's called the state space. I'm not going to define that right now either. If I drop something in here, I can guarantee that as that system moves, it is going to move in this direction, and it's going to end up in this system somewhere, because this is an attractor. It's never going to go outside the state space. It's always going to move in here. Now, on one level, this thing looks pretty predictable, right? It kind of looks like a butterfly, and this little thing, if you followed it forever, will never leave this envelope. On the other hand, you can never predict from one instant to the next where it's going to be. Right? And I really believe that a lot of the programs that I evaluate are chaotic attractors. By the way, the common word is strange attractors, but that's too sexy a word and not very explanatory, whereas these things really are chaotic systems, and so it's better.
No.
I'm sorry?
You say you can't predict where it's going to be. I mean, it seems to me that if you wanted to predict where it's going to be at the next instant of time. If you take it as one instant of time,
Right.
At the next instant of time, it's going to be somewhere closer to where it was than,
But that's
across
not
on the
true
other
in a strange attractor.
across on the other side of this system, right?
No, in a chaotic attractor, see, it may go off, and you got what they call a bifurcation point in here, and it may go off, it may come down here, go off in this direction, with the tiniest little change, it may come down here and go off in that direction, and a second or two later, it end up way over here instead of way over here. That's the nature of these attractors. So on the one hand, they're entirely predictable. On the other hand, they're not very predictable at all. And that's sort of...
Well, I never see it jumping across from left
if
to
you
right.
watch it, it will jump. If you watch it long enough, it will jump. There it goes. It jumped. So,
Well, but it went in a particular track.
yes, but the next time it jumps, it'll go on a different track. The tracks are unpredictable. That's the nature of these things. You can actually show that mathematically. So, I mean, there are lots of programs that are like that, where I can figure out approximately where it's going to be. If my intervention is successful, in a case like that, I can say it's going to be in here. And it's not going to be in here, but that's all I can say. Well, that has a lot to do with things like how specific can your model be, right? I mean, the models I deal with are pretty darn specific, that if we get these people to solve problems, they implement these solutions, variables A, B, and C are going to improve, and here's how they're going to improve, and I can measure that. And if I take this program, I put it in railroad A or railroad B or railroad C, I know what's going to happen, right? And so I can set up models that are really pretty specific in their outcomes. What you're really saying here is that there's some performance envelope, some outcome envelope for your program, and the best you can do is specify that. And that has, to me, I think a lot about how specific my outcome measures are going to be when this happens, and also the range of things you can tell policymakers. You could say, you know, if this program is successful, it's going to be in here somewhere, but you can't tell them exactly what it's going to be doing. And that drives people crazy because they want to know, and usually they have to spend money, and they're beholden to Congress, and they really want to say this is exactly what it needs to do. But if this kind of program theory is right, and personally I think there are a lot of programs where that's true, there are real limits to what you can say about the outcome of that program. So that's this notion of a strange attractor. And that, I think about that all the time, actually.
Well, it seems to me there might be some analogy here to multivariate statistics, where on the one hand you try to make a prediction and you come up with a measure of the central tendency.
Right.
But then on the other hand, you also have a variability or variance around that measure of central tendency, and that's the uncertainty.
Yes.
Part of it, right? So
There's no reason not to look at it that way. The reason I don't look at it that way is because that assumes you're always looking at a single variable or a set of variables, whereas I'm a great believer in unintended effects of programs, and so I actually think that there's a wider range that you would get.
Well, then you have in multivariate statistics the residual.
That is true.
That isn't explained by any of the...
Right. There is no reason not to think of it that way. Best I can tell you is that
Well, then I'll just continue to think about it. No, I'm just...
you should absolutely, you know, we're all engineers and not scientists here. We ought to be, and if it works, that's what you ought to do. It has nothing to do with what's true or not, which is a separate conversation. But it is true. In any case, thinking about this notion of chaotic attractors helps me think about the performance envelopes of programs. And if that's useful to people, that's great. And by the way, there are many different kinds of chaotic attractors. I happen to pick one that I like, but there are hundreds of them. They're easy to find if you ever want to see them.
Well, you know, an example from politics, it just happens to that. An example from politics always is, well, you have politicians who say, well, if you send me to Washington, I won't be like everybody there. I'll be totally different. But then it turns out, once they are there, after a period of years, they're pretty much in the same space as everyone else,
Well, I don't know if it's depressing or not, but do you want to think of it as those kinds of attractors where you can really predict where they're going to go? Or do you want to think of it as those kinds of attractors where you never know where the politician is going to be exactly? And I'm not sure which of those two analogies is more depressing.
Well, you do know where the
you are, right?
politician's going to be. I mean, no matter how much, what kind of an outlier philosophy the politician had before they got sent to Washington, the conventional wisdom is it will converge on one of the, established.
I would think of that as an attractor like that,
Yeah.
right? Where, politicians go to Washington, they might be right wing, they might be left wing, at least up the last 10 years or so, they end up coming to the center. And that's because that's the essence of, assuming you want to get something done, you have to compromise. If you're going to compromise, you're going to move to the center. And that's the, at least up until recently, that is the dynamic. So yeah, I mean, you could think of that as movement to the center as being an attractor.
Sure. That's what I wanted to say, but I didn't.
No, it's, in any case. So there's an example. I time for one more example.
Yeah.
Okay. I think a lot about outcome distributions, okay. That top example is sort of an example of teaching kids math, right? And you have a good curriculum, depending on how good this curriculum is, some kids are going to improve more, some kids are going to improve less. But for the most part, we think it's a symmetrical distribution, and if you can figure out, where this mean is, you can get some general idea of how much kids are going to improve, and you can look at the variances, and you can say, okay, yeah, this is about how much kids are going to improve, and I have control groups and all that stuff, so I really believe it, right? And here's the range. And compare that to a different program. Compare that to a program in which you are trying to generate small businesses, right? And you are interested in the effect of, let's say, job creation in your small business incubator, right? That, if you look at the number of jobs created per business in your incubator, it is not going to look like that. It's going to be this kind of a distribution. If you turn it into a log transform, it would be a straight line going down. And what that means is you've got a very small number of companies that are going to create a very large number of jobs, and a great number of companies that are going to create very few jobs. Now, and there are lots of things in the world like this. Earthquakes are a good example. The sizes of cities are good examples, and these kinds of things show up all the time. Well, if I were evaluating a program like this, if I were advising policymakers, the first thing I'd say is, I'll calculate an average for you, but it's not going to help you very much. The other thing is I would try to get people to understand what success means, right? Success doesn't mean you're going to take this average and shift it. Success means that you're going to maybe take these inflection points and sort of move them a little bit, in this case to the right, so that you would have a little bit larger number of companies that create a lot of jobs. But it changes the policy recommendation, it changes the claims to success, right? What you want to say is, boy, am I clever. I've been able to fund a portfolio of projects such that I've had 10 really successful companies, and forget the fact that 100 haven't succeeded or succeeded to a minimal degree. I wouldn't expect them to. But boy, am I clever. I was able to pick 100, the 10 were really, really very successful. Now, that's not how most people like to think about programs. But if you believe that certain kinds of effects in the world are log linear distributed, then that is really how things are going to look. And, I think about that all the time. And I think about it certainly with I have this big debate on whether or not we should look at number of accidents or costs. And I'm a great believer in number because I think there's so much random variation around cost that sort of doesn't really mean very much. But people like to think about cost, right? And I'll bet you once we look at that data, it's going to be distributed like this. We're going to have very few accidents that are going to cost tremendous amounts of money. The train that is just a little bit too high, or not making this one up, it goes through the tunnel, takes the top of the train off, takes the top of the tunnel down, right? This is a very expensive problem, but it could just as easily have been, we need to repaint the top of the car, and that would have been that much of a fraction. So I have a lot of problems with that, but to the extent that we look at cost, what I really try to say is, look, people, the outcomes are going to look like that. It's not going to look like that, and it has some real sort of policy implications. Questions? Yeah.
Well, it might not be a bell-shaped curve, even if we're talking about learning. I just happen to have spoken to a industrial economics professor the other day,
someone
right?
who knows something about the subject. I'm in
And
trouble.
what he pointed out is that his grades were a U-shaped.
Really?
In other words, a substantial proportion of the class got it and got good grades. Another substantial proportion just couldn't get it and just failed, or got D's. and very few students got like a mid-level or mediocre grade. So his objective was to try to, decrease the number who didn't get it,
Yeah.
and increase the number who got it, rather than worrying about or trying to get some students to achieve mediocrity,
Right.
because that didn't seem to be how they learned industrial economics.
Right.
Either they got it and they got good grades, or
Well, no, I think it's a great example. I mean, I don't mean to say that this is the only alternate distribution. There could be many of them.
Yeah, well, I think the point is that if you assume that that the actual real world distribution is this Gaussian curve or Filchin
Right.
curve, then everything you do will be wrong. I mean, your statistics will be wrong,
Right.
and then your understanding of outcomes will be wrong.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, it sounds like this guy has a bimodal distribution,
Yeah.
but it sounds like there's something about the nature of learning the subject. It's not
There
just
might be
sort of a
something
random
about the
thing.
nature of learning the subject, but this may pertain to other subjects also.
No, there's no question about it. No question. I mean, I picked this one because there's lots of these kinds of log linear distributions coming out of the world of complexity, but that's absolutely true. I mean, if you make that wrong assumption about what the real distribution of the world is, even if you did the right statistics, which you could do, you'd still be making wrong assumptions about program theory. We have time for one more.
It's one right now, so if anyone has questions, maybe.
Okay, questions.
Okay, Steve.
And then if you want to stick around, I'll show you the
I
other
have
one.
one question.
Sure.
Doctor, when you are simulating, you are departing from a stochastic process, or you are having previous collected data and you are simulating from the patterns that you found?
Well, that's part of the problem is the people who build these simulations are like kids in a sandbox, right? They make things up. For any, it doesn't matter whether it's an agent-based simulation or systems dynamics or whatever, unless you base it on real-world data, it's a lot of fun and you can see a lot of interesting things, but whether or not that's really going to explain the reality of the world is another story. And that's one of the reasons why I don't really think that program theory is either or, because any kind of simulation you do, you'd like to base that on observed real-world behavior. Otherwise, it's a lot of fun, but, what good is it?
So thank you everyone for coming. Please join us next week. Dr. Jerry Johnson from Grand Valley State University. He's the director of their Center for Community Research Institute. So he will be joining us. So we can thank Dr. Morell for coming.
Around, I'll show you something involving network theories, which actually has a lot to do for people working in communities. So if anybody has a few minutes.
I don't know.
Chris, is the room available for another 5-10 minutes?
Very much.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh,
If
yeah.
anybody wants to see a great example that will be relevant to anybody working in communities, you can do that. It's not that long.